This lens is currently the cheapest APS-C autofocus lens you can buy. And anytime you hear that something is the cheapest of anything, you really do need to ask, well, is it worth buying even if it is so cheap? But in many ways, the performance of this lens truly exceeds its price point, particularly when it comes to sharpness and detail, autofocus performance, and build quality. These are three areas where I generally expect budget lenses to be not quite as good. This one is absolutely spot on in every one of those categories. It is not a perfect lens, and it does have flaws, and you would expect it to at this price point. This is a reasonably new release lens by 7Artisans. It is a 27mm f2.8 autofocus lens. Once again, like many of the products I cover on this channel, it is only available at a few different suppliers. I will put some links in the description down below where you can buy the lens. In addition to that, at the time of shooting this video, it is only available on one mount, but I expect there to be more coming. But I've also linked a very similar lens to this in the description down below, which is a lens that I previously reviewed. It is a little bit more expensive, has a couple of extra features in it, but if you're looking for a budget autofocus lens, it's pretty much either that one or this one when you're looking at this sort of price point. Now, I love the 27mm focal length on APS-C sensor cameras. This gives us a 40mm field of view full frame equivalent, and this is absolutely one of my favorite focal lengths to use. And that's primarily because it is so versatile. It allows you to get a little bit of a portrait shot where you can isolate your subject and kind of make them the star of the show, but it also allows you to back up a bit and get a little bit more of the context and the surrounding environment around you. I actually find this focal length a lot more interesting than what is considered the standard all-purpose focal length on APS-C sensor cameras, which is somewhere around 23mm. I think 27mm just gives you a little bit more isolation and is a little bit more interesting. I've been recently out using this lens as an all-purpose travel and behind-the-scenes lens. My daughter is currently shooting a short film, and I wanted to document what was going on, document her making the movie. And because this lens is so small and I can put it on a small APS-C sensor camera, I've got that. I can help her with holding the reflector, help with holding a boom pole, something like that, whatever she asks me to do. But I can have this little camera just hanging around my neck, just ready to go on a short strap, and at a moment's notice, get a little clip here and a little clip there. Now, this is something that often you might use a kit lens for, because the kit lens in most cameras is very similar size to this lens. But this lens at 27mm is f2.8. Most kit lenses are going to be around 4.5 or 5.6 or something like that. That means that this lens is going to allow twice the amount of light in that a typical kit lens is. That means you're going to be able to use a lower ISO value, which means that you are going to get significantly cleaner images. f2.8, if you get close enough to your subject, is also going to allow you to blur out your background and get some subject isolation or subject separation, which you are not going to be able to do with a typical kit lens, which I think is important because I think this is the type of lens that somebody with a kit lens looking for their first prime or fixed focal length lens will be looking at. The other thing I've been using it for is just general purpose family travel, walking around the city, going to events. Once again, the small size, the fact that it goes to f2.8, improved low light performance over the kit lens is a significant advantage in those situations. And I think when we look at a lens like this, the first thing you're going to think is a lens this cheap, the build quality is going to be poor. This is absolutely not the case with this lens. It is an all metal body. It's got a polished little metal lens mount. It's even got a place to update the firmware in the lens. So you just pull off this and you've got a USB-C port so you can update the firmware. And for the price point, it is incredibly well built, and I don't think there's a piece of plastic anywhere on this thing. So the first thing you're going to notice is the build quality is phenomenal for the price point. The one thing I will say is the manual focus ring is quite stiff, probably stiffer than it should be. So if you are going to be manually focusing, particularly for video, it probably will shake the camera around a little bit. But at this price point, that's probably just being a little bit too critical. It's not unusual for budget lenses to have significant problems with distortion performance. This lens exhibits a moderate amount of barrel distortion, but interestingly, and I was kind of surprised by this, even this cheap lens has in-camera corrections where the lens tells the camera how to correct that distortion. So if you're just shooting JPEG straight out of camera, the lines are perfectly straight and there's effectively no distortion whatsoever. If you do import the raw files into Lightroom, you do have to correct them. But it does have in-camera corrections which will work for both JPEGs and for video. At f2.8, the lens does exhibit reasonably heavy vignette, which is not ideal, and for an f2.8 lens, I wish it was a little better, but it's not terrible, and at f4.0, it's almost completely gone. Once again, I'd love to see a little bit better performance here, but for a budget lens, I think it's fine. The next place that budget lenses often let themselves down, but something that has changed significantly in the last year or so, is chromatic aberration performance. And that is a purple fringing around high contrast areas in a scene, whether you've got something backlit or you've got black and white like on a sign or a test chart, you can often get purple fringing. Well, I would say there is basically little to no chromatic aberration whatsoever in the in-focus areas with this lens. If you look at what's called longitudinal chromatic aberration, or LOCA, this is a change in the color cast in the out of focus areas before and after the plane of focus. This lens does exhibit a moderate amount of that, but nothing that you really see in real-world results, with the exception of situations where you have an out-of-focus area that is backlit, and then you will often get some strong color fringing on those out-of-focus backlit areas. Now, up to this point, there's not a single trait in this lens that I think is a deal breaker for just about anyone, but this is the one that is probably going to kill the deal for some people, but I think some people are actually going to like it, and that is the flare performance with this lens. It has a very unusual and confusing type of flare performance. There were some situations where there were lights in a scene and I was sure that the lens was going to have problems with flare, and it had no problem whatsoever. Scenes were high contrast and the images looked excellent. But then there were other situations where the lens seemed to be flaring out quite badly. The image became desaturated. In some cases, it just almost completely ruined the image. And I couldn't even exactly figure out why or where the light was coming from, because I previously had situations where it seemed to be handling the light without any problem, which I thought would be a problem. And now these are situations where the lens is completely flaring out and I can't even figure out where the light is coming from. And I think the place that this lens really struggles is backlit scenes, or when you have a large light source, like a whited out sky or someone with a direct large backlight behind them. The lens seems to just collect this light and just flare out and desaturate the entire image. Now, I will say, when walking through the city at night, there were times where I thought the flare looked amazing, and the flare was taking on the color of the lights, and it really almost looked like something out of a Hollywood movie. So depending on what look you're going for, some people might love it, some people might hate it, but it is a significant thing that you need to know about this lens. You are going to get some very strong flare in certain situations, and in some cases I think the images look great, in other cases I think it just completely destroys the image altogether. The close-up image quality with the lens is actually surprisingly good. It is sharp, it is detailed, it is high contrast. It is a good close and detailed lens, which is nice as a travel lens because you might be out and, taking photos, traveling with your family, and you want to get some photos of food or something, some close-up image or flowers or something like that. It's going to be able to do that double duty, and it does take some very nice, sharp and detailed, high contrast close-up images. Looking at sharpness at f2.8 wide open in the center of frame, it is very, very sharp. It is high contrast. I absolutely cannot fault it for a lens of this price point. And even in the corners, it is surprisingly good. Not as good as the center of the image, but not far off. And it obviously gets a little bit sharper as you stop down, but from f2.8, it is plenty sharp enough, and I don't think there's any lack of sharpness and detail, and I don't see anyone being disappointed in the ability of this lens to render detail. Finally, looking at bokeh and background blur, I think the bokeh and background blur is okay without being mind-blowing. I might call it a 6 out of 10 or something like that. Given this is a lens where you don't generally get deep out of focus backgrounds anyways, unless you get reasonably close to your subject, I think it's fine for what it is. And certainly at the price point, I can't find too much fault with the out of focus areas from this lens. So this is the 27mm f2.8 by 7Artisans, but TT Artisans also make a 27mm f2.8. And I've just shown that video on screen now. That is a lens that's actually available on more mounts than this one. It's a little bit more expensive, but it also has an aperture ring included. So I think if you're considering the 7Artisans lens, you should also have a look at the TT Artisans as well.